Hello, everyone, and welcome virtually to Euclid Public Library. We have a special guest to speak with us today, the Director of Education and Outreach at the National First Ladies Library and Museum, Stephanie Bohnak. They are located in Canton, Ohio, so not too far from us, but not too close either. So I think we saved her a drive. So without further ado, here's Stephanie to tell us about the First Ladies Library and Museum.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me this weekend. And thank you, actually, yes, for saving me a drive because it is bitterly cold. And I do a lot of programs for a lot of different people. And in fact, I was talking with Kentucky last week, and their weather was not nearly as frigid as ours here in Northeast Ohio. So it's always a pleasure when I get to do a program and I'm nice and cozy at home. I like to try to do my programs a little bit casual. So you'll notice that occasionally you will see me, laugh at how human first ladies of the United States and our first ladies of Ohio, how human they really are. So as Frank said, my name is Stephanie Bohnak. I'm the Director of Education. Actually, my title has changed, so I apologize. And Curatorial Services. So I also get the pleasure of working within our collection, which is massive. And I hope that you do get an opportunity to come down and see some of our exquisite artifacts. Um, if you have questions throughout my presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat. I'll try to get to them if they are pertinent to where I'm at in the presentation, but if not, I will absolutely take time at the end to answer some additional questions, whether that be about the program itself or what we do at the National First Ladies Library and Museum. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. While I'm doing so, please feel free to put in the chat if you've ever been to the site, because I always love to see that. Some people don't even realize that we exist in Northeast Ohio. So it's always a pleasure when we get to share that important history around our first ladies. Sorry, excuse me. All right. So I assume that many, like me, are a true Ohioan. I was born and raised in Ohio. I love Ohio history. I love women's history. I love First Ladies history. So this is probably one of my favorite programs to give, and I promise that I will try to keep it at an hour. We are talking this evening, though, about seven incredible historical First Ladies. So I will try my best. If you have to leave at any point, as I'm sure you probably saw, Frank is recording this, so hopefully you get to enjoy the full program at your leisure if you're not able to stay the full time, and I do happen to run over. So just to get started, as I said, a lot of people don't know who we are, where we are, what we're doing. So the National First Ladies Library and Museum is the only institution of its kind. There is no other site in the entire world dedicated to celebrating the lives and legacies of our nation's first ladies. We were originally founded in 1995 by this lovely woman you see in the bottom, my right corner, Mary Regula. She was wife to Congressman Ralph Regula. And the National First Ladies Library, in its original name, we've added on museum, was intended to help fill gaps in American history where First Ladies' stories should be told and their lives researched. It was then in 2000 that former President Bill Clinton signed a bill establishing the organization and the site as the 380th unit of the National Park Service, designating it as the National First Ladies Historic Site. Today, that relationship still thrives as a partner one between the Library and Museum, a 501c3 nonprofit, as well as the National Park Service. Our campus not only hosts the Library and Museum within the Visitor Center, but it also preserves and maintains, you look at the top right, the historic Saxton McKinley House, the childhood home to our very own First Lady Ida Saxton McKinley. The museum within that visitor center also hosts a Victorian theater, a research library, conference and seminar rooms, archival storage and processing rooms, as well as our featured and temporary exhibits. Display is our 2024-25 featured exhibit, Leaders in Literacy First Ladies as Teachers, Educators, and Librarians, presented by Huntington Bank. This extensive exhibit is wonderful. It's not just about one First Lady. It's about numerous, actually, in fact, over a dozen First Ladies who have dedicated part, if not all of their life, to shaping young minds, whether that be literacy efforts, working within school systems, or even advocating for literacy and education. I will say this exhibit does end in April of this year, so I do hope that you get a chance to come out and see it. And if you do, please tell them that you know Stephanie, and hopefully I can pop down and show you around. Right now, we are open for our winter hours, Thursday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And the exhibit is actually completely free for your own self-guided pleasure. That being said, if you are interested in touring that historic house that you can see here on the left, tickets can actually be purchased for a ranger-led tour with our National Park Service staff at that same visitor center where the exhibit is. So do come out and see us. I'm also pleased to announce that our next exhibit opening in May will be titled The Eras Exhibit, 250 Years of First Ladies' Progress and Power. So we'll be celebrating America 250 by talking about every first lady from every era. So do stick around and hopefully come see us this spring. Now, to get into the actual meat of our program, and as I said, if you do have questions, please let me know and I will try to answer them as quickly as possible. I also recognize that as a historian, I get very jazzed about history, especially local and Ohio history. So I'm trying to make an effort to slow down when I talk. If you need me to slow down further, repeat something, or even go back a slide, please just let me know. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Ohio's history is rich and incredibly complex. So it should come as no surprise that the first ladies of the United States who called Ohio home embody the state's motto, with God, all things are possible. Empowered, often educated, the first ladies who hail from this state are ones that have often driven progressive ideals, who embolden the disenfranchised, and who leave indelible marks on not only local history, but national history as well. And I apologize, I'm going to look at this just to. Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't have any questions right now, and I promise I will look at your comments as well. So, the lives and legacies that I'm going to be talking about this evening are Anna Harrison, Lucy Hayes, Lucretia Garfield, Caroline Harrison, Ida McKinley, Helen Taft, and Florence Harding, and those lives are all worthy of further exploration. Please note, I will also be going in chronological order. So what you're seeing are some of the earliest first ladies in our nation's history, all the way up pretty much until the 1920s. Often forgotten, in fact, due to her incredibly short term, First Lady Anna Harrison was the first First Lady in American history to be widowed while holding the title. Although Anna Tuthill Sims was originally born in Morristown, New Jersey in July of 1775, she moved to Ohio with her father, Judge John Cleves Sims, what a mouthful, when she was only 19 years old, and she made Ohio her home. The move was prompted by her father when he took up land for a brand new settlement known as the North Bend of the Ohio River, today North Bend, Ohio. And as a result, young Anna brought her Eastern taste and dainty clothes to the frontier as early as 1794. Now, for the first 3 years after her mother's death, Anna Sims was raised by her father, but at the time he was actually in full military service, so he was unable to fully care for and raise her, leading her to eventually be raised by her maternal grandparents, who from then on out supervised an exceptional education and continued to raise her into her adulthood. Anna Sims was originally educated at the Clinton Academy in East Hampton, New York, and it is believed that she was educated in the classics and the basics of English around 1781. She then attended the boarding school of Isabella Marshall Graham from about 1787 to 1791, also in New York City. It is actually believed that Anna Harrison is the First Lady to ever receive a formal primary education. During her time at the boarding school, it is also believed that Anna was influenced by her teacher, Isabella Marshall Graham, a Scottish immigrant, a widow, an early feminist and social activist, and also the school's founder. Unfortunately, with the exception of those two pieces of education, we have very little record of Anna Sims' life following her completion of studies, pretty much up until she moved to Ohio in 1794. It was here in Ohio that she was waiting for her father's home to be built that she actually decided to stay with her older sister Maria and her brother-in-law Peyton Short in Lexington, Kentucky. It was there that she met and fell in love with a young Army officer, acting Captain William Henry Harrison, who had been fighting in the Northwest Territory against indigenous peoples. Now, it's unclear if Anna Sims eloped with Harrison, but we do know that Judge John Sims was initially opposed to the marriage on the grounds that a military career, something he had personally experienced, wasn't sustainable to raise a family and provide for a wife fully, not just financially, but also emotionally as a partner. We do know that eventually, after getting to know his son-in-law, they did actually become quite fond of each other. William Henry Harrison had become very famous in his era for his military career. He ended up spending much of his life more as a public servant than anything. His family, including his beloved wife, Anna, moved west with him while he served as the Secretary of the Northwest Territory as well as the Governor of the Indiana Territory. In their life together, Anna gave birth to a total of 10 children, although their last child died in infancy. Mrs. Harrison bore the largest number of children by a first lady in American history, yet she outlived all but one. A product of her time, Mrs. Harrison found her sense of purpose in her role as a wife, as a mother, and a devoted member of her church community. In 1799, when Harrison was named the territorial governor of Indiana in 1801, I apologize. In 1799, when Harrison was elected to Congress, sorry, got ahead of myself, Anna Harrison joined him in then the capital city of Philadelphia. Later, when Harrison was named the territorial governor of Indiana in 1801, she moved the whole family back then from D.C. to the western frontier, where they built a brick mansion named Grouseland. Although the house was kind of situated amid wilderness, the furnishings within the house are said to have reflected Anna Harrison's East Coast upbringing. The house was protected by fortified walls in hopes of securing the family against rebellious indigenous tribes nearby. During Harrison's various negotiations with these indigenous leaders, it was his wife, Anna Harrison, who welcomed and entertained Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, as well as his brother, who was also the tribe's spiritual and political leader, Tenskwatawa. As the War of 1812 quickly approached, the family returned then back to Ohio to North Bend, and it was in this home that Anna Harrison learned of her husband's electoral victory, to which she was initially displeased at, and she is quoted in saying, "I wish that my husband's friends had left him where he is, happy and contented in retirement." Now, despite her initial opposition to him running for president, she was still very visible during the Tippecanoe and Tyler II campaign in the 1840 presidential election, and when he was elected, William Henry Harrison was already 68 years old. When he arrived in D.C. for the 1841 inauguration, it is believed that Anna Harrison herself was unfortunately too ill to travel to D.C. at the time. Alongside, as many of us can respect, being in February with uncertain winter weather. That was a concern for her travels, but at the time, she herself was already 65 years old. So as a result, they sent the daughter-in-law, Jane Irwin Harrison, who would accompany William Henry Harrison and act as his White House hostess until Anna was supposed to arrive in May of that year. Now, we don't know exactly what Anna Harrison was suffering from. Some believe that it is a bit of melancholia as they had just lost a child. Others believe she may have been afflicted with some kind of flu. Regardless, she did actually recover, and it was by early April that she was packing her bags to join her husband in Washington, D.C., when she learned the shocking news that her husband, the President of the United States, had died. Because she would not have arrived in D.C. in time for the funeral, Anna Harrison remained in their North Bend, Ohio home, making her the only incumbent First Lady who never actually entered the White House. Following her husband's death, Anna Harrison became a national figure as a presidential widow. She was the first to be awarded a congressional pension totaling $25,000, which is kind of insane even now. She was also granted free postage for all of her outgoing correspondence, and we as historians know that she maintained an unusually heavy correspondence, so she took full advantage of that free postage. She maintained correspondence not only with her family, but there was a general interest in her husband, and so she maintained much correspondence with the public, answering questions about her late husband. She even established one of the rooms within their 22-room North Bend home as a one-room museum to her beloved William Henry Harrison, in which she often welcomed visitors and displayed an array of objects from the most recent election. Now, despite suffering many personal losses, Anna Harrison maintained an interest in the world around her. She stayed up to date on American politics and remained immensely involved in her church. She even remained interested in politics. She originally supported the Jacksonian Democratic Party, but eventually became a passionate supporter of the emerging Republican Party because of its abolitionist stance. Now, you'll probably notice that when we talked about Anna Harrison, I don't have a lot of pictures of her. And that's because historically there's only one surviving portrait of Anna Harrison left existing to this day. as every item that she owned, including that one-room museum, her clothing and furniture, was destroyed in a fire that engulfed the entire Harrison home in July of 1858. Now, because the fire started in the middle of the night, all members of the household did escape unarmed, but they also were only left with the clothes on their backs. Following this, Anna Harrison lived the rest of her life at a place known as Point Farm, which was home to her one remaining child, John Scott Harrison, who was also the father of future President Benjamin Harrison. On February 25th, 1864, Anna Harrison died at the old age of 88 years old, and to this day is the only woman who was both wife to a president and grandmother to another. Moving on, as I said, chronologically, the next First Lady I'd like to talk about is one that is historically beloved within her own era. Born in August of 1831 in Chillicothe, Ohio, to Dr. James Webb and Maria Cook, Lucy Webb was the youngest of three children. Now, we know that her father's family, he had inherited, enslaved folk, and the family was staunchly abolitionist in its mindset. We don't know if they actively participated on the Underground Railroad, but we know that they thought slavery was wrong. Thus, when Lucy Webb was only 2 years old, her father traveled all the way down to Kentucky to emancipate those he had inherited as property. And it was actually while he was there that he fell victim to a massive cholera epidemic and died. As a family without a father, but raised in the Methodist faith, young Lucy Webb was exceptionally educated and incredibly passionate about causes that were close to her heart. She attended school in her hometown at the Miss Baskerville School, or the Chillicothe Female School, from roughly about 1837 to 1844. Very similar to Anna Harrison, there's very little documentation to provide insight into what she studied, but we know based on anecdotes that even in her primary education, she was considered an outspoken student. In 1844, the family moved to Delaware, Ohio, where her older brothers enrolled at Ohio Wesleyan University. Now, although she was technically not allowed as a woman to enroll in the college herself, she was permitted to do so as long as she was alongside her brothers. It was there while she was studying that she learned French, composition, grammar, and penmanship, and was said to have received merit points for her conduct. It was also here on the campus of Ohio Wesleyan that she met a young lawyer, Rutherford B. Hayes. Several months into her time at Ohio Wesleyan, young Lucy Webb transferred to the Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, where she was described as diligent. During her time at the Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, she regularly composed topical essays on a weekly basis, which, if you read them, highlight her religious and moralistic attitudes towards American society, including and especially temperance. We know that at some point in her life, she was said to have taken an oath of temperance influenced by her one grandfather. She was so progressive, she even expressed her belief that in all things, woman was equal to man, and is quoted in saying the following: "Instead of being considered the slave of man, she is considered his equal in all things, and his superior in some." In 1850, Lucy Webb graduated, making her the first First Lady in American history to have graduated from college. As I mentioned, she had previously met the young Mr. Hayes on Ohio Wesleyan's campus, but after reconnecting, it is believed that the two completely fell in love with one another. They were engaged in 1851 and married in the Webb family home in December of 1852. They then lived in Cincinnati until the outbreak of the Civil War, and it is during that time that many believe Rutherford B. Hayes was actually influenced religiously and morally by his wife to also oppose the institution of enslavement. In total, the couple had 8 children, although unfortunately only 5 lived past childhood. Lucy Hayes is believed to have attended an early suffrage lecture led by fellow Ohioan Lucy Stone, yet her interest and involvement in the women's movement did fade as she became engrossed in her responsibilities surrounding motherhood and housekeeping. She did remain morally and openly against enslavement for the rest of her life, and is even believed to have taught her free black servant, Eliza Jane, to read and write. She also then was led to support the newly founded Republican Party as well. According to many sources, Lucy Hayes was very attuned to and involved in her husband's career. Together, the two were said to have supported and empowered one another. And although neither believed initially that war was necessary to end slavery, Lucy Hayes did support Rutherford B. Hayes' decision to volunteer for military service. As often as she could, Mrs. Hayes, sometimes with her mother and with her own children, would visit him in the field. It was during this time that she eventually won the affectionate nickname Mother Lucy from the men of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry who served under her husband's command. It is also during this time that, unfortunately, due to the conditions within the camp, which we know are both unsafe and unsanitary, that two of the Hayes children would pass away during this time. Still, many soldiers remembered her visits to camps where she ministered to the wounded. She cheered up those who were homesick, often acting as a motherly figure. She even provided medical assistance when she was able to do so, but is often most remembered for actually patching up uniforms, bringing her sewing machine all the way into the field. As many people know, it was Rutherford B. Hayes's honors and achievements during the war that had eventually won him an election to Congress, and then later 3 post-war terms as governor of Ohio. During this time as a public servant, it was his beloved wife, Mrs. Hayes, who came to be her husband's political confidant. Pregnant with their only daughter when Hayes ran for governor in 1867, she played a crucial role with her agenda to reform welfare institutions. She actively worked to create an Ohio orphanage for children of Civil War veterans, and once she established it, it became one of her primary public concerns, both as First Lady of Ohio and then eventually as First Lady of the United States. In 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes and Lucy Hayes left Ohio for Washington following the 1876 contested election, there was no inauguration ball, and the celebration of the new presidency was kind of on hold because when they got there, they still technically didn't know if Hayes had officially won. Now, as I said, Lucy Hayes was an incredibly popular first lady, and especially one so popular in Ohio. She entered the White House amid that election dispute with much confidence and grace. Her happy and long marriage, her knowledge of political circles, her natural intelligence, and her good humor gave her the strong foundation in which she became a beloved First Lady. She was often remembered for her own self deprecating humor, and she enjoyed informal parties and spared no effort to make entertainment at the White House attractive. Although, as I mentioned, she was a supporter of temperance and alcohol was forbidden at events, she still remained a popular hostess, once hosting a 17-course meal. In fact, she was said to be the first president's wife to actually ever be called First Lady. Other than that, it had often just been the president's wife. Lucy Hayes continued to support causes that she had believed in during her time as First Lady of Ohio. As I mentioned, that orphanage that she would continue to support, but then she also began regularly visiting the National Deaf Mute College and the Hampton Institute, where she sponsored a scholarship for a student of color. She contributed generously to Washington charities and is even believed to have begun the Easter egg roll on the White House lawn after children of Washington had been banned from doing so on the Capitol grounds. Now, by the end of the Hayes' term in office, Lucy Hayes became, directly quoting, the most widely known and popular president's wife the country has known. The Hayes returned in retirement to Fremont, Ohio, to the Hayes family home at Spiegel Grove in 1881, which you can see here a picture of them on the front porch at the Fremont home, and it's beautiful. I highly recommend going there. It was here that Lucy would spend the last 8 years of her life. A few days after a stroke, the former First Lady, beloved by many, passed away in June of 1889 at the young age of 57 years old. Been nicknamed Crete by those she was close to. Lucretia Garfield was very similar to Lucy Hayes, an incredibly educated young woman, especially for her era. And this was due in large part to her father's simple love of learning and his belief that all of his children, regardless of gender, should be educated. Born in April of 1832 in Garrettsville, Ohio, Lucretia Rudolph was the oldest of 4 children born to Zeb and Arabella Rudolph. As the eldest child, she learned the responsibilities and chores of farm life, as well as what it would mean to run a household. Lucretia Rudolph was described as a petite young lady with high cheekbones, a high forehead, and dark hair and eyes. She was said to be especially intelligent, but some regarded her as cold, as she was very shy, serious, and reserved. Many speculate that maybe she was seen as cold is because she didn't quite grow up in a very affectionate home. In fact, it was not notorious for it. She later recalled that her mother only kissed her infrequently, and she never remembered being kissed by her own father. Now, that being said, even though they were not outwardly affectionate, the Rudolph parents were very kind and especially interested in their children's advancement. Thus, religion and education were placed at the highest importance within the household, and Lucretia Rudolph was especially passionate about these as well, um, and had a beautiful fascination with reading. She was actually quoted once in saying that it would be of about as much use to stop breathing as to let books alone if they are anywhere in the region about me. I have to read as I have to live. Following her local education, her parents sent her to the Geauga Seminary, which was a co-educational school, and she was able to actually board on campus with other young women. It is there that she received a very well-rounded education, being instructed in Greek, Latin, mathematics, natural science, philosophy, geography, and music. It was also during this time that young Lucretia Rudolph first became acquainted with James A. Garfield, who she saw as and this is another direct quote, an overgrown, uncombed, unwashed boy. She also came to later regard him as some sort of strange genius, given that he was the smartest in their class. In the fall of 1850, Lucretia Rudolph enrolled in the first term at a brand new college, the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, Ohio, today known as Hiram College. The non-denominational coeducational institution was established by the Disciples of Christ, which is the religion that the Rudolph family prescribed to, and her father was on the board of the trustees, being a great supporter of the school. So much so that he not only helped to construct the first building on campus, but he actually moved his whole family from Garrettsville up to Hiram Hill so that he could be closer to his passion project. The classical coursework that Lucretia Rudolph would have taken was significantly more difficult than her previous education, and in addition, she now began to study French, sang in the Glee Club, helped begin a literary society, and even edited the school magazine, The Eclectic Star, in which she wrote regular essays and drew sketches for. In the spring of 1853, James Garfield and Lucretia Rudolph began noticing one another, and in November of that year, he wrote the first of what would become over 1,200 letters throughout their courtship. And I think it's very interesting. You can see this far left photo. It looks like it's a class photo, and it is. You can see his hair's a little crazy, but that is James A. Garfield right there in the front. And in the middle is lovely Lucretia Rudolph, a very petite woman. It is believed that when they took this class photo, James A. Garfield actually kind of lobbied the photographer so that he could sit next to Lucretia Garfield because he just thought she was that lovely. Now, following her graduation from the Eclectic in June of 1854, Lucretia Rudolph herself became a teacher at the Eclectic. She would also then go on to teach in Ravenna, Bryan, which is on the kind of all the way over to the border of Indiana, as well as she would teach in Chagrin Falls and Cleveland. During this time, James Garfield was attending Williams College in Massachusetts, and the two shared a courtship, which was actually regarded as pretty rocky at times, until 1858, when during a buggy ride, they decided to try a life in union at the age of 26. The wedding was simple and held in the Rudolph home in November of 1858, where Crete wore a modest white gown with lace. There was no honeymoon, and the two pretty much moved immediately into a boarding home where their first child, Eliza Arabella, nicknamed affectionately Little Trot, was born in 1860. James Garfield's career and his service in the Union Army from 1861 to 63 ended up actually causing some strife in the family. Not only was the family apart, but the marriage suffered as a result. The couple would actually come to refer to this time as the dark years in their marriage. Still, in October of 1863, James and Lucretia Garfield became parents again, but it was December of that year that Eliza Arabella, as I said, nicknamed Little Trot, died, devastating the family. As a result, the couple found a new closeness in their grief, and from then on out, promised to always keep the family together. Thus, when James Garfield was elected to Congress in 1863, the whole family moved with him to D.C., and there, the couple, being both previous educators themselves, assisted in their children's education and advancement. In Washington, the couple shared intellectual interests with friends, they read together, they even made social calls together. Following his election as President of the United States, the now close-knit family moved into the White House. Unfortunately, her time as First Lady was cut very short, in May of 1881, Lucretia Garfield fell gravely ill with malaria. And if any of you have been to Washington, D.C., you often hear it referred to as the swamp. And it very much, in this era, was a dangerous place to live because of how swampy it was and how rampant malaria could be. She convalesced and tried to recover from malaria at a seaside resort. She did so for most of the summer in 1881 until July 2nd, when she got the news that her husband had been shot at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. Barely recovered herself, First Lady Garfield returned to Washington, where she spent the next 80 days caring for her husband. This gained her universal admiration for her devotion, strength, and her tireless efforts. It was during this time that one of the doctors that she worked with very closely was Dr. Susan Edson, a female surgeon who it is believed her homeopathic solutions for the gunshot wound could have potentially saved James A. Garfield's life and yet were overlooked by the other attending male physicians. Unfortunately, as many people know, James A. Garfield would eventually die in September of 1881 due to an infected bullet wound. Following her husband's assassination and death, word reached Lucretia Garfield that Dr. Susan Edson was not being paid the same as her male peers. Edson, one of America's first female physicians, graduated from the Cleveland Homeopathic College in 1854 and is believed to be the seventh woman in the United States to obtain a medical degree. Thus, when Congress determined the payment for the late president's doctors and recommended paying the male physicians $10,000 and only $5,000 to Dr. Susan Edson, listed as a nurse, it was Mrs. Garfield who declared it to be gender discrimination. She insisted that all physicians be paid equally and is quoted in her letter to the committee as follows. As far as real service was concerned, that rendered by Dr. Rayburn bore no comparison to Miss Edson's, and it seems to me only injustice that this discrimination be not made in favor of Dr. Rayburn. As I said, she initially wished to remain anonymous, but of course it's a former First Lady, so it was widely covered by the media. It was later discovered, though, that as a result of her advocacy, Dr. Susan Edson was eventually paid the proper $10,000 for her service to the late President Garfield. Now, following her husband's death, an outpouring of national support created a trust fund for Lucretia Garfield and her family, as well as she received the annual congressional pension as the widow of a president. This afforded Lucretia Garfield, as I'm sure you can imagine, quite a comfortable life, one in which she was able to continue furthering her children's education before she focused her energy on various memorials to her husband. For those of you that know of the monument up at Lakeside Cemetery, it was Lucretia Garfield who was deeply involved in the design and construction of that memorial to her late husband. And if you haven't been up there recently, please do. They recently cleaned the stones, and it is stunning. It looks almost as if it would have in the late 1880s. So do go and see it. Now, with the intention of one day also writing a memoir in honor of her late husband, Lucretia Garfield created the first memorial presidential library within their home. In fact, she actually added a whole wing to the house in which she developed a research room and a vault that held all of his papers that were considered important to her. She would also continue to write essays after she'd established this. And she continued to add and improve to the home in Ohio, which you can still see today at the James A. Garfield site in Mentor, Ohio, before she moved to South Pasadena, California in 1901, where she enjoyed milder winters, which again, I think we can all appreciate as Ohioans. Now, at various points in her life, Lucretia Garfield also briefly lived in England and Massachusetts, and she remained a frequent guest of her successors, including both First Lady Frances Cleveland and First Lady Ida McKinley. She maintained a correspondence with former First Ladies Julia Tyler and White House hostess Harriet Lane. So as you can probably imagine, Lucretia Garfield lived a full and remarkable life, finally passing away at the age of 85 in March of 1918 in South Pasadena, California. I don't know how many of you have heard about Caroline Harrison, but she is one of the most underrated first ladies in American history, and I'm not the only person that thinks that. A lot of historians agree. In fact, it was the centennial of President Washington's inauguration that heightened a national interest similar to America 250 in the nation's heroic past. And in 1890, Caroline Scott Harrison lent her prestige as First Lady to the founding of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution, serving as their first general president. Caroline Scott was born in October of 1832 in Oxford, Ohio, to Mary Potts Neal Scott and John Witherspoon Scott, a professor of science and math at the brand new Miami University. An educator himself, and similar to other first ladies you've heard, John Scott ensured that all of his daughters, Lizzie, Caroline, also known as Carrie, and Mary, received as good of an education as his sons, John and Henry, did. Thus, a young Caroline Scott grew up in a house filled with books and music. In 1854, Dr. Scott, alongside several other professors, broke away from Miami University over issues of abolition and educational equality for women. It is actually believed that Dr. Scott himself participated in the Underground Railroad, assisting freedom seekers on their journey. We just don't know to what extent. That being said, they were seen as a bit radical and a bit weird, unfortunately, in the era. That being said, she remained staunchly a supporter of abolition as well, and remained a very equal-minded individual. As a result of his abolitionist tendencies and sentiments, he moved the entire family to Cincinnati, where he then started to found an all-girls school. And it was there that Carolyn Scott first met Benjamin Harrison, who was said to be immediately smitten with her and her witty attitude. In 1849, the Scott family moved back to Oxford, Ohio, and it was here that Dr. Scott officially founded the Oxford Female Institute, where Carrie Scott attended as a student and developed a lifelong love for the arts. Although Benjamin Harrison was attending the Farmers College in Cincinnati, he actually transferred all the way up to Oxford, Ohio to attend Miami University so that he could be closer to Carrie Scott and her, quote, dancing brown eyes. Their courtship was something that you would say is probably complimentary. Benjamin Harrison was known for being very solemn, shy, reserved, serious, and although she may not look it based on these portraits, Carrie Scott was known for being very humorous, lighthearted, and kind of musical in her day-to-day activities. It is believed she encouraged him to be more relaxed, and despite her father's wishes, she even regularly invited him out to dances. Upon her graduation, she herself became a teacher and actually was an instructor for music just across the river in Kentucky. It is believed that she experienced some health issues while living in Kentucky. We just don't know what, unfortunately. That being said, we know based on letters that Benjamin Harrison urged her to come back to Ohio, and when she did, the two were married in October of 1853 in her father's parlor. Wishing to live a life away from the Harrison name, Benjamin and Carrie, they moved to Indianapolis, actually, to begin their life together as early as 1854. There, Harrison began his law career, and his wife started to raise their children and build a home for each other. She did give birth to a third child in 1861, but unfortunately, that third child passed away as a newborn. As it did for many Americans, family life changed at the outbreak of the Civil War. It was during this time that General Harrison served for the Union Army and became noted in his profession, while Carrie cared for their son, daughter, provided active service to the First Presbyterian Church, donated to an orphan's home, and even extended her hospitality to many friends, often entertaining them by playing piano. During the Civil War, she supported the Union Army philanthropy and also served on the Ladies Patriotic Association of Indianapolis. Known for being blessed with artistic talent, it was also during this time that she would continue to not only occupy herself with piano, but she would start to begin taking painting lessons from an artist known as Paul Puchki. And she would actually later go on to exhibit her work locally, which is very cool. She was that talented, and she loved florals and china patterns. Due to his military service and his successful law practice, Benjamin Harrison eventually would become a political force. His election to the Senate in 1880 brought the whole family to D.C., and it is believed that Carrie Scott Harrison supported her husband's political aspirations. In the 1888 presidential campaign, she was considered the true asset, actually, of the campaign because of her charm and openness that offset her husband's kind of reserved nature. It was actually Mrs. Harrison who often spoke to the press rather than her husband. And in November of 1888, Benjamin Harrison was officially elected as President of the United States by electoral vote, but not by popular vote. We know that Caroline Harrison enjoyed a little bit more of a private life than that of probably a first lady. But still, she moved into the White House in 1889 with poise, and she continued to be a gracious host. During her husband's administration, their daughter, Mary Harrison McKee, and their two children also would move into the White House. Unfortunately, you probably don't hear much about Caroline Harrison because her term as First Lady was unfortunately, and I know not purposefully done, but it was actually overshadowed by both her predecessor and her successor, Frances Cleveland, who served two non consecutive terms of First Lady. And it was Frances Cleveland, this young First Lady, who actually made Mrs. Harrison seem older than she was. Despite this older appearance and this kind of getting dragged in the media, Caroline Harrison was extremely involved in women's issues. Some even believe that she was radically inclined, which we can probably attribute to that abolitionist, equality minded upbringing. One such example of this is that she is directly responsible for the installation of electricity in the White House. It was Mrs. Harrison who made up very detailed plans to enlarge the existing building to eventually include an east and a west wing, something we're very familiar with now within the White House. And in doing so, it would face two art galleries. Now, unfortunately, Congress kind of squashed these plans, but she eventually was still able to modernize the kitchen. She had several floors refinished, and she even had rooms re-wallpapered, all of which met Frances Cleveland's approval upon her return to the White House in 1893. As I mentioned, Caroline Harrison was known for her love of art, specifically flower paintings and china patterns. Um, so, because she was so fond of those painting lessons, she actually invited Paul Puchki out to Washington, D.C., and opened the china painting classes she was taking with him to anyone who wanted to learn. Her interest in Chinaware led her to fully catalog all the past administration White House china, as well as she designed her own china for her husband's administration, which you can see here on the far right. It's lovely because the gold corn husks you see kind of bordering it is a nod to their Midwestern upbringing. With other progressive minded women, she also helped to raise funds for Johns Hopkins University Medical School under the condition that with those funds it begins to admit women. As First Lady of the United States, she hosted elegant receptions and dinners. And as an artist herself, again, she actually created a painting of a White House orchid, one of her favorite flowers within the conservatory on the White House campus. And she gave that painting to a national magazine, making it so that anyone could have a piece of First Lady art. The print was dedicated to the public with the following inscription: painted by the president's wife, dedicated to the mothers, wives, and daughters of America. And you can find that print just about anywhere. You go on Amazon and you can still find it today and have a piece of Caroline Harrison's artwork in your home. Now, alongside all the other modern things she was doing, it was also Caroline Harrison who was the First Lady to have a Christmas tree in the White House, despite her own sister dying that December of 1889. It was also Caroline Harrison who lifted the ban on dancing at the White House, which had been in place since 1854 when Sarah Polk was still First Lady of the United States. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1892, Carrie Harrison became very ill, and many believe she became very depressed, and she was later diagnosed with tuberculosis. They attempted to give her some reprieve with a summer in the Adirondack Mountains, but unfortunately, that failed to restore her health, and she ultimately would come back to DC to the White House in September of 1892. It is there for about a month that she lapsed in and out of consciousness, and according to some, when her dear husband asked if there was anything that they could do, she apparently just smiled and said, "No, dear." Caroline Harrison passed away in the early hours of October 25th, 1892, at the age of 60. As I said, despite being often overlooked, Caroline Harrison's legacy was one that was denoted by good causes, often said to be ahead of her own time, and some historians speculate her to be our most underrated First Lady in United States history. So, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, since we have the childhood home of Ida Saxton McKinley, I can't do an Ohio First Ladies program and not talk about our very own hometown hero, Ida McKinley. Now, for the longest time, Ida McKinley was misrepresented historically, and she was always just kind of written off as an invalid due to episodic seizures and some muscle weakness that at times would rely on a wheelchair or even kind of rely on her own husband, William McKinley, to assist her in her walking. Born in Canton, Ohio in June of 1847 to Catherine Kate DeWalt Saxton and James Saxton. Ida Saxton grew up in a very extremely wealthy and well-to-do family, as her father was a hardware store owner, owner of a banker, Stark County Bank, a businessman, a real estate developer, an investor, and a property owner. She was the eldest of three, although we know that Ida McKinley was especially close with her younger sister, Mary. She would attend the Canton Union School, and we know that she was influenced very early by her teacher and later mentor, Betsy Mix Cowles. Betsy Mix Cowles was said to be her favorite teacher, and she was the founder of the Ohio Women's Rights Association and the Women's Anti-Slavery Society. At Canton Union, Ida Saxton would have been instructed in English, science, vocal music, and drawing. She was also instructed in mathematics, and it appeared that she actually had an affinity for mathematics and financial management. When Betsy Mix Cowles was hired to teach at the Delphi Academy in New York, Ida and Mary followed her, and she continued to receive instruction in all aspects of accounting and financing. In fact, it was Ida Saxton's father who believed that all of the children should be educated and have some kind of skill should they ever lose a spouse, need a job. He really believed that they should be prepared for all things because life is unpredictable. Now, the time in New York was very, very short. This small piece of New York at the time, immersed within the beginnings of the Civil War, had some Confederate sentiments. And for Ida Saxton and Betsy Mix Cowles, who were very much against slavery, it turned out to not be the ideal scenario for them to be there. And they actually quickly returned to Cleveland, Ohio to finish her education. Both Ida and Mary Saxton continued their education to finishing school, where they attended boarding school at the Brook Hall Seminary in Media, Pennsylvania. Many attest that she commenced her time there an alert, compassionate, and opinionated woman with sharp wit. Following her time at the seminary, she was officially employed by her father as a clerk at his Stark County Bank before eventually being promoted to cashier. And it was actually even during her father's absences that she was entrusted with being bank manager should he not be on site. As I'm sure you can probably imagine, for the era, banking and finance were considered an all-male venture, and so there are some that believe that Ida and her family would have received some local disapproval. Some believe that she was overeducated, in fact, for her gender. Regardless, she and her father defended their right to work. As I said, Ida Saxton grew up a very privileged, advantaged woman. But despite that upbringing, she was naturally a humanitarian at heart, and she actively used her heightened social status for public good. Now, alongside working in her father's bank, Ida Saxton also volunteered as a Sunday school teacher at the First Presbyterian Church, which she and her grandfather had helped to fundraise for and establish. Her paternal grandfather is also recognized for his influence on Ida McKinley to use her privilege for public service, something that would later support her immensely as the spouse to a public servant. As a result, she became hyper aware of those going without and would go on to provide food, monetary donations, and even made regular visits to the downtrodden. As I said, the Saxton family was a little atypical. Everyone was well educated, women had the same advantages as men, so it was a little atypical for society, but very typical for the Saxton family when Ida and Mary Saxton were gifted a grand tour of Europe at the age of 22, as these trips were typically reserved for young college-educated men. The two women spent about 6 months exploring the continent, as it was called, and their letters written back provide some really interesting historical insight into this stunning young woman who would eventually become regarded as the Belle of Canton, Ohio. It was also during this time that Ida is believed to have further developed her empathy for those less fortunate, specifically working women who often had to endure grueling physical labor to support themselves. One such example of this is the painstaking work of lace making when she was visiting Belgium. It is believed that that actually struck a chord with Ida Saxton, who ended up purchasing large amounts of their work. And for anyone that's interested in fashion and textile history, lace making for the longest time was especially grueling and often conducted in dank basements to preserve how fragile the lace was. So you can imagine that it wasn't the best working conditions. Now, it was during this era in her life when she got back from Europe that she would eventually catch the eye of Union Army Major William McKinley Jr., who was also an up-and-coming lawyer. It is speculated that the two met at an 1868 summer picnic in nearby Myers Lake, and although there's no definitive date that we know of in which the courtship officially began, it became very clear that the two shared a special love, one founded on mutual respect and shared intellect. In fact, Ida Saxton herself asserted that although the marriage proposal she received from William McKinley pleased her Union sympathizing family, her acceptance of his proposal was entirely of her own independent decision. Married at 23 years old to William McKinley Jr. in January of 1871, Ida Saxton was first married in the church that she and her grandfather helped fundraise for, making it the first wedding ceremony that took place in the new house of worship. The ceremony was jointly performed by her Presbyterian minister, his Methodist one, and the wedding was well attended, speculating to have over 200 guests. They then honeymooned on the eastern seaboard before leasing a house in Canton that was originally owned by her father. As William McKinley advanced in his career, his young wife dedicated a lot of her time to home and husband, and the two welcomed their first child, Katie, on Christmas Day in 1871. Kate was the apple of her parents' eyes. Many believe she could just do no wrong, and you'll see a picture of her down here at the bottom. There are many pictures of Katie in general. They loved her very much. And if you look closely and you look at pictures of Ida and William, she seems to be the perfect blend of the two. Now, unfortunately, the first 3 years of their marriage was wrecked with tragedy. Ida McKinley would lose her mother, several of her grandparents, and it was actually during this time that she herself suffered a head injury of blunt force. It is also during this time that she was amid her second pregnancy, where she was struggling immensely with their second child, known as baby Ida, who was born in 1873 prematurely. Unfortunately, baby Ida, we don't have many, if any, pictures of her because she only lived to be 4 months old. It is during the second pregnancy that it is believed Ida McKinley, based on research, was suffering from a severe case of preeclampsia, which at its worst can actually cause convulsions, mimicking that of epilepsy. Following the death of little Ida, as she became known, the only other remaining McKinley child, Katie, herself died from typhoid fever in 1875, and this is believed to have deeply traumatized Mrs. McKinley. Some actually believe that of all the losses that she suffered, this is the one that she never recovered from. When William McKinley went to Washington, D.C. in 1877, following his election to the House of Representatives, his wife was placed in the care of a neurologist, Silas Weir Mitchell, based out of Philadelphia, and his legacy to cure women was one that required them to be kind of situated in solitary isolation because women like Ida McKinley, their brains were being overworked, and the best cure for that was simply rest. Now, as a result, the lack of movement would actually cause phlebitis in one of her legs, and she would suffer muscle weakness on the right side of her body for the rest of her life. Other doctors and neurologists attempted to halt Ida's unpredictable seizures, but actually many of these cures and treatments would further lead to medical issues. One example of this is Dr. John Bishop of New York, who in the early 1890s began sending William McKinley unregulated bromides, which sedated his wife but did not cure this kind of unpredictable seizures that she kept having. And for those of you that don't know what bromide is, it is a type of horse tranquilizer. It is a potassium bromide is the base chemical of it. Now, despite these ongoing struggles with her illness and with her loss, we know that William McKinley was actually never very far from his wife's side. Because before becoming governor of Ohio, it was known that William McKinley would regularly rearrange their life together to provide accessibility and assistance for his wife. She's often most remembered for being confined to a small rocking chair in which she crocheted bedroom slippers. Yet that being said, Ida McKinley was not permanently invalid, despite what history would have you believe for the longest time. She actually still enjoyed hiking and walking, especially in downtown Canton with her beloved husband. And in fact, as you can see here in this one picture, they celebrated their 10-year wedding anniversary in the Sierra Mountains, where you can see Ida McKinley, although yes, she does have a hiking stick, she's actively hiking and walking within the Sierra mountain range. So that being said, she was not permanently invalid, and we've been able to prove that It was more so a campaign smear tactic. Even when her health did confine her to stay inside, she was often drawn, though, into William McKinley's work. And we know that he also purposefully kept the door of his home office open so that she, in their parlor, was made privy to even the most confidential meetings. By the time of McKinley's second inauguration as governor of Ohio in 1893, Ida McKinley kind of appeared ambivalent regarding the prospect that her husband could run for president, although we know she worried for his health, wellness, and safety should he take on that role. As I mentioned, it was a pretty big deal that Ida McKinley be able to walk in front of the press. Um, William McKinley, in preparation for his presidential campaign, rented the original house that they were married and began their marriage in. And this would become known as the campaign house. This is not the historic Saxton McKinley house. The campaign house is now where the Stark Library is in downtown Canton, and there is a marker designating it as such. That being said, it was during the campaign that Ida McKinley played a very vital public role, and on most occasions, she was well enough to speak and meet with many political figures. She even regularly appeared before crowds as she listened to his speeches. Unfortunately, this only lasted about 2 months prior to the election, when a period of recurrent seizures prevented her from continuing on with those public appearances. So when she arrived as First Lady of the United States in 1897, all media eyes were given on her, given that she was regularly painted as an invalid in attacks against McKinley. Ida was determined to prove her own ability during the inauguration ceremonies. When she arrived from the train to the nation's capital, she walked the entire length of Union Station without any assistance. Likewise, she ascended every marble step of the Pension Building for the inauguration ball. As First Lady of the United States, she did not allow her health or her disability to hinder her role, as she still readily received guests at formal receptions. Contrary to normal protocol, she was actually seated next to her husband pretty much for every event and meal so that William could keep an eye on any impending seizures. We know that she supported numerous public issues, although First Ladies today usually have just one cause. Ida McKinley was the first First Lady in American history to declare her public support for women's suffrage prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. She also personally supported the Crittenden House, which through its several centers across the United States served as a place for homeless, impoverished, and downtrodden unemployed women. These shelters also provided nutritional meals as well as training for trades to help get women back on their feet. She was also a supporter of the American branch of the Salvation Army, and she supported various organizations in their fundraising efforts by donating a pair of her famously crocheted personal slippers to auctions. As First Lady of the United States, she also sponsored musical events at the White House and appeared to have been instrumental in facilitating the appointment of a woman at the American delegation for the Paris Exposition. Now, unfortunately, amid these accomplishments, the increased application of bromide took a dramatic effect, leading her to eventually suffer from bromide intoxication by late 1899. And she would suffer a serious set of seizures, followed by a period of melancholia. We know that Ida McKinley did visit Niagara Falls with her husband during their trip to Buffalo, New York, yet we know that she also avoided all the excursions at the Pan American Exposition due to the large crowds. Therefore, she was not allowed alongside her husband when he was shot by Leon Zologos on September 6, 1901. In the 6 days that followed, in which it appeared that William McKinley might recover, Ida McKinley was allowed to remain by his side, but unfortunately, when it became clear that he would not survive his bullet wound, she was permitted to see him only one last time, but then further prevented from being with her husband in his last moments. Ida McKinley returned to Canton, Ohio as a widow and maintained traditional mourning periods. Afterwards, she did resume her public activities. She even exercised some political patronage, and she anxiously awaited the completion of the McKinley Monument. Unfortunately, she died 4 months prior to its dedication on May 26, 1907, at the age of 59 years old. She was then laid to rest alongside her husband and their 2 children in the McKinley Memorial Mausoleum. I apologize. We're about an hour in. I've got 2 more First Ladies if you're willing to stick it out with me. I promise they're just as fascinating. So the next one I want to talk about is Helen, also known as Nellie Taft. She's most known for bringing the Japanese cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C., and her role as First Lady of the United States was one denoted by music and the arts. During her 1877 visit to the White House as a guest of the Rutherford B. Hayes administration, Nellie was sparked with a determination herself to one day live there as First Lady of the United States. Called Nellie since her childhood, Helen Herron was born in June of 1861 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Harriet Collins Herron and John Williamson Herron, a lawyer and district attorney. Nellie was the fifth of 10 children and was first educated at the Miss Norris School in her hometown, where she is believed to develop a lifelong love for music, supplemented by her lessons from George Snyder from the Cincinnati Music School. Following her primary education, she would enroll at the University of Cincinnati, where she enrolled in German and chemistry courses. Nellie's formative years were, as I said, influenced by that visit to the Hayes White House, and especially influenced by her mother's affectionate but platonic relationship with the former president of the United States. Upon her graduation from the University of Cincinnati, she, like many of the other first ladies you've learned about this evening, became an educator, finding employment as a teacher at local private schools in the Cincinnati area. In these roles, she often taught French 4 hours a week, and she did so for 2 months at Madame Frieden's school as a substitute teacher, earning a total of $50. Afterwards, she became a regular instructor at the White's Psych School for Boys, which had just opened in Cincinnati. As I said, that visit to the White House was kind of her origin story, if you will. And it was after that visit that she actually met, quote, that adorable Will Taft, a young lawyer. The two were believed to have met at a sledding party, and they shared many intellectual interests, so much so that what became a lovely friendship would eventually blossom into a sincere love and fondness for one another. Determined not to marry for the traditional reasons of starting a family, Helen Herron had full intentions of also finding a partner who respected and encouraged her interest. And she was particularly interested in politics and economics, so whoever would be her husband would need to respect that. William Taft even called her a treasure, stating that she was self-contained, independent, and of unusual application. Nellie Herron and William Taft were married in June of 1886 in the Herron family home, and the couple embarked on building their family, which would result in 3 children in total. From 1887 to 1888, Nellie Taft would volunteer as a kindergarten teacher in Cincinnati, in which she led her class in art instruction, which specifically included sewing, drawing, and even sculpting. What's unique about this is that she volunteered her time. There was kind of a rule in this era that if you were a teacher as a single woman, you should give up that role once you become married, as you're taking a single woman's salary, should you keep that job. It was her mother-in-law who was kind of part of this beginning of the kindergarten movement in the Cincinnati area. So instead of taking a paycheck, she volunteered her time. Now, she did find out that she was pregnant in January of 1889, and as a result, she in general did not return to work or to that volunteer role as a kindergarten teacher. She instead set her sights on supporting her family and empowering her husband's career. She actively was involved in the music culture of Cincinnati, and music had always been such a passion of hers that she actually helped to found the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. As a result, she was elected president, the first president, from her position on the board of directors. Mrs. Taft welcomed every step of her husband's career, in stride state judge, solicitor general of the United States, and even a federal circuit judge. Still, we know that Mrs. Taft had higher ambitions for her husband's career. And in 1900, when he agreed to take charge of the civil government within the Philippines, she was delighted to undertake the journey with him and her family. In a region still unsettled by war, Nellie Taft rose to the challenge and handled her difficult public role with enthusiasm and tact. She was noted for her respect towards indigenous Filipino peoples and remained widely admired for her natural empathy. She strongly urged then her husband to also accept President Theodore Roosevelt's offer to become his war secretary, and upon his acceptance, the family then moved to Washington, D.C. As I'm sure you can imagine, compared to living within the Philippines and being that high profile of an official, you can probably imagine that Nellie Taft actually found the role of cabinet wife to be quite dull. And so as a result, she put much of her energy into then securing Roosevelt's support for William Howard Taft to become the 1908 presidential candidate. It is during this time that we know that she was more thoroughly involved in the political elements of her husband's 1908 presidential campaign than in any other aspect of his career. And in doing so, like many of these other first ladies, Nellie Taft became a political confidant and actually an advisor to her husband. Her role was largely hidden from the public, but there was an occasional newspaper reference to her active political role. When William Taft was elected as President of the United States, she made history by becoming the first First Lady in American history to ride alongside her husband in the inauguration parade. As First Lady of the United States, Nellie Taft made immediate and drastic changes to running of the White House, many of which were both intended to be politically symbolic as well as practical. One of these changes was the replacement of white ushers employed at the White House with African American ushers in uniform. Although we recognize this was still part of the domestic staff, the position became a very highly prestigious and sought after role. In fact, it actually gained her much praise in a New York Times editorial. In contrast to the social codes of her predecessor, Edith Roosevelt, Nellie Taft also lifted the ban on having divorced individuals invited to the White House. And instead of only inviting high society figures to formal events, she invited all members of Congress, their families, as well as all ranks of military who were stationed in the area. She personally enlarged the social schedule of dinners to include a season of musical concerts, which allowed her to invite a diverse set of artists to the White House who, had she not, maybe would have never had the chance to actually get that far in their music career. She was also credited with the decision to officially convert the presidential transportation from horse-drawn carriages to the new automobile, and personally drove herself around Washington, D.C. in a brand new electric vehicle. She personally enjoyed champagne and playing cards. So it should probably come as no surprise that as First Lady, unlike others, she readily served alcoholic beverages at events. In fact, it was prohibitionists and women's Christian temperance unions lobbied to her own husband to get her to stop. Yet Nellie Taft continued to serve her famous champagne punch, which also was praised widely in newspaper editorials. Unfortunately, only 2 months into her role as First Lady, Nellie Taft suffered a massive stroke. Yet she was known for her resilience and strength, which had her back in command within the year. Now, although it was a devastating stroke, the fact that she was able to recover was pretty remarkable, and it still did leave her with a residual speech impediment, something that Mrs. Taft would eventually grow very self-conscious about. As a result, she limited her public remarks and also started to kind of pull back from the press, keeping her personal life as private as possible. And in doing so, she allowed her daughter, also named Helen Taft, to act as her White House hostess. As I kind of mentioned at the beginning, her most lasting legacy as First Lady of the United States is the creation and development of the West Potomac Park, and most famously, her vision to surround the area in Japanese cherry blossoms. This was influenced by Luneta Park in Manila, where she experienced all levels of society who would come and enjoy music within the park. While in the capital city, a Japanese scientist actually learned of the plan, and he met personally with Mrs. Taft, and the two developed a plan to have Tokyo, Japan donate about 2,000 cherry blossoms to her cause. Unfortunately, the initial shipment was found diseased, and they needed to be destroyed promptly upon their arrival in December of 1909. But this cause had gained so much momentum that a new shipment was planned, and this time it contained 3,000 cherry blossoms, which arrived in perfect, pristine condition. Nellie Taft and the Japanese ambassador's wife planted the first two trees in March of 1912, which are said to still survive to this day. Due in part to her stroke and kind of pulling back from politics, it was actually also William Taft who would stop confiding in his wife. He was worried that she accidentally might slip up and say something confidential, and as a result, his image was somewhat damaged due to her lack of advice and counseling. Eventually, much of Mrs. Taft's influence was leaked to the press, and there was widespread understanding of her being one of the most political first ladies of her time. When her husband lost the re-election campaign in 1912, Nellie and William Taft moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where he began teaching law at Yale. She, too, began working on her own projects, specifically her own autobiography, which was published in 1914, making her the First Lady in American history to have her personal memoir published in her lifetime. In 1921, the couple returned to Washington, D.C. following Taft's nomination as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it was during this time, actually, that we know Taft was experiencing some health issues. Nellie Taft was very concerned for her husband's heart condition, and she remained at his side as a devoted wife until his death 10 years later. As a widow, Nellie Taft resumed her global travels to places like Egypt, London, Mexico, and Italy, and she remained politically active, socially, even attending several events to meet who would become the future First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Nellie Taft's life was full of music, art, the occasional poker game, and the cultured former First Lady passed away at the age of 81 in May of 1943. Thanks for sticking it out with me, you guys. This is the last one, I promise. If you want to start thinking about questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and then at the end, I'm happy to get to them. So Florence Harding is a unique woman as well. She was affectionately referred to as the Duchess by her husband, Warren G. Harding, and her life was pretty exceptional. Even in her childhood and young adult life, Florence Kling was regarded as an independent and strong-willed young woman. Some believed her to have a self-reliance that was rare of the times in which she grew up and for her gender, and she was later regarded as one of the most progressive and forward-thinking first ladies in American history. Some historians actually argue that it was Florence Kling Harding prior to Eleanor Roosevelt who eventually modernized and forever altered the role of First Lady of the United States. She was born in Marion, Ohio in August of 1860 to a very wealthy family. In fact, it is believed her father was the richest man in town. So kind of like Ida McKinley, she was afforded much opportunity and was incredibly well educated. She went to the Union School in Marion, Ohio, and for several years she also studied classical piano. She later attended the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and she did have intentions to become an internationally known female pianist. When she was 19 years old, it is believed that she eloped with their neighbor, Henry DeWolf. Now, the details of this marriage are especially vague, as there's little historical or legal record of their union. Actually, most historians claim that they just shared a common law marriage in nearby Galion, Ohio, and the first legal record of their union is tied to the birth of their son, Eugene Marshall DeWolf, in 1880. Now, unfortunately, Henry DeWolf was said to be a spendthrift, a heavy drinker, suffering from alcoholism, and he would actually abandon Florence and their baby son only 2 years later in 1882. Following his desertion, Florence Kling returned to Marion with her young baby, DeWolf, and she filed for separation from Henry DeWolf as early as 1884. It was finally in May of 1886 that she officially filed for divorce and was granted such under gross neglect of duty, following which she used her maiden name, and she would continue to use it for the rest of her life almost as her middle name. As I mentioned, she was a strong-willed and independent woman at heart, and as a result, she refused to return home, especially given the fact that her father really did not like Henry DeWolf and disapproved of the relationship in general. She attempted to provide for herself and her small child by teaching piano lessons at 25 cents an hour within the same rooms that she rented from friends. Despite her initial attempts to provide for herself and her child, being a piano teacher unfortunately just was not sustainable, and as a result, her father, Amos Kling, took over guardianship of his grandson. Some historians believe that it was during this time that Florence Kling was a piano teacher, that she was potentially giving lessons to Charity Harding, and she would then meet her future second husband, Warren G. Harding. Now, regardless of how she met him, Amos Kling was furious at his daughter's taste in men. He would actually later go on to try attempting to sabotage the Harding reputation. He even attempted to sabotage the Marion Star, Harding's newspaper, to get his daughter to see that the match was beneath her. Now, despite this, Florence Kling Harding had big hopes for her husband, who was only 5 years younger than herself. The two were married in July of 1891 in the house they built together on Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion, Ohio, which is today the Harding Historic Home Site. 2.5 years into their marriage, Warren G. Harding needed to seek medical treatment at the Kellogg Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. It is speculated and documented that he was suffering from both a nervous and a physical ailment. And we know historically that Warren G. Harding would struggle most of his life with stress eating, and he would eventually actually gain weight and suffer some heart problems as a result. In his absence, it was his wife, Florence Kling Harding, who assumed the role of business manager of the Marion Star. It was there that she created a circulation department to provide newspaper delivery to both homes and businesses in more remote areas. She also fully staffed the department, often training newsboys from working class families. She was considered to be vital to the newspaper's good fortune. She even helped to obtain the first direct wire report received in Marion regarding the Spanish American War, giving the Marion Star an international news presence. Now, for the first 15 years of their life together, the Hardings enjoyed a very happy marriage, one that is remembered for being very equal. That being said, historical evidence suggests that Warren G. Harding had an affair with their neighbor, Nan Britton, before and during his time in the White House. Nan Britton would later claim that Harding was the father of her daughter, Elizabeth Britton. This, for the longest time, was written as political slander. And it wasn't until 2015, so almost 10 years ago now, that this rumor was finally put to rest as DNA testing proved that Harding was, in fact, the father of Elizabeth Britton. When Warren G. Harding was finishing his first term as lieutenant governor in 1905, Florence herself fell ill with her first bout of kidney disease, something that would continue on for the rest of her life. This first attack was severe enough to require surgery, and as a result, she never returned to work for the Marion Star. The recovery also took a full year, and it was during this time that Warren G. Harding appeared to find solace in Carrie Phillips, pictured at the bottom of this slide here, an attractive former teacher and family friend, as well as a neighbor whose husband was also conveniently ill. Now, unfortunately, unlike the Britton affair, this one is incredibly well documented. There are dozens of love letters and poems that Harding wrote to his lover, and in total, the affair lasted 15 years. I have read some of the letters. You can find them online. They are naughty, to say the least. I don't like to read them aloud for programs because some of them are quite graphic. Now, despite this scandal, Florence Kling Harding stood by her husband, and it was that dedication that would pay off. In November of 1914, Warren G. Harding was elected senator, and a Columbus paper proclaimed Florence a most satisfying Senate spouse. She was regarded as, quote, a loyal wife, a charming hostess, a sympathetic neighbor, and an ardent Republican of the stalwart type. In early 1920, as her husband's career continued to advance politically, Florence Harding consulted Marcia Champfrey, a well-known Washington, D.C. fortune teller and astrologer, who predicted that if Harding was able to win the Republican nomination, he would go on to win the presidency, but he would not live to complete the full term. So, headquartered on their front porch, that is a very much an Ohio thing, the front porch campaign. They situated themselves on their front porch in Marion, Ohio. And in doing so, Florence Harding was able to play a dual political role as both a traditional housekeeper as well as a modern activist. She is one of the first, if not the first ever future First Lady to actively participate on the campaign trail. She was outspoken about women's equality and suffrage, and she appealed to many Americans. I also want to include, because some people ask what he looked like, the bottom left corner, that is a picture, one of the only ones we have existing, of Florence Kling Harding's first husband, Henry DeWolf. The First Lady of the United States to actually be able to cast a vote as a woman, Florence Kling Harding officially voted for her husband in the 1920 presidential election, later situating herself as both a modernist and traditional First Lady. Now, despite those ongoing kidney health concerns, First Lady Harding found herself energized by her role and worked tirelessly to expand access and visibility to the White House. Perhaps her most lasting legacy, in fact, is those advocacy efforts. Closely concerned with her husband's business, she was an especially strong activist for those who could not otherwise speak up for themselves. First Lady Harding invited not only women's political groups, but also women federal workers, girls graduating high school, college girls, and even female students of color from the local Dunbar High School to the White House. She continued to break that unwritten social code about inviting divorced women to White House events. And although she did not publicly address the issue of birth control, she refused to condemn the movement for it when she was pressed publicly by a reporter. She donated to the creation of a Women's National Republican Club in New York and passionately supported a prison reform that grew from the harsh experiences of women suffragettes in prison. The reform later resulted in the Alderson Reformatory Prison, the first federal correctional institution exclusively for women, which emphasized rehabilitation over criminalization to provide life skills for those who would eventually be released. A skilled horsewoman and known animal lover, Florence Kling Harding was also an advocate for the humane treatment of animals. known for her photos, as you can see here in the center, with her Airedale Terrier Laddie Boy. Humane groups knew that they could count on the First Lady's support and endorsement. In fact, Mrs. Harding was radical in her public support for the National Society for the Humane Regulation of Vivisection and the National League to Conserve Food Animals. She was also a strong advocate for the more traditional goals of the ASPCA and the Animal Rescue League. Among all of the other causes, in general, she was particularly passionate about the animal rights. She once stated that cruelty begets cruelty, something I think we could all say is still relevant to this day. She continued that hardness towards animals is certain to breed hardness towards our fellow man. She even made sure that animals lost in the Great War, World War I, including horses and mules, were not forgotten, and she attended a tree planting ceremony in their honor in October of 1921. Her final cause was that of veterans from the First World War. Early on in her time as First Lady, she recognized that in her husband's administration's rush to get back to normalcy, a lot of these veterans were kind of getting ignored and falling by the wayside. She regularly invited veterans to the White House for parties every summer that she was First Lady. She visited them in hospitals, in their personal homes, and if they were artists, she also patronized their creative work. In the rush to forget World War I, she worked quickly to amend this. Now, unfortunately, Florence Harding's term as First Lady ended incredibly unexpectedly, and there have been many rumors and speculations about it. While on a 1923 trip to the Western United States and the territory of Alaska, President Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack suddenly. Following his death, Florence Kling Harding traveled cross country with the funeral procession to Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, in the next year, her own health began to decline. She returned to Ohio in hopes of recovering, but ultimately passed away from kidney failure in November of 1924. She was then buried alongside her husband at the Harding Memorial in Marion, Ohio. And you can see here, this is just a few examples of her causes. Up in the far left, that is actually photographic evidence of her registering to vote for the first time and being able to vote in that first presidential election. At the bottom left, you can see a picture of her with veterans with Warren G. Harding. And then finally, far over to the right, you can see the image of her among numerous women, which is a cause she was very, very passionate about. So thanks for sticking it out with me. These women are exceptional. They are barrier breaking. They are progressive in their own rights. They are instrumental in Ohio history. And some of these women are the most bold and forward thinking women of their time. Many of these individuals themselves personally revolutionized the role of First Lady, yet unfortunately, they have very little appreciation in American history. First Ladies like Anna Harrison, Lucy Hayes, Lucretia Garfield, Caroline Harrison, Ida McKinley, Helen Taft, and Florence Harding are true Ohio treasures and are vital in national history. So thank you so much for sticking it out with me. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. You're welcome to put them in the chat. I see one question. Which First Lady do we know relatively little about? And what is the holy grail of historical artifacts that would reveal more about a First Lady? That is an incredibly tough question, Frank. And it's a twofold one for sure. We know very little. It's interesting, actually. There's a huge public fascination with Jackie Kennedy. Everyone loves her. It's the fashion, it's the diplomacy, it's the arts. But the thing is, there have been recent works and research that show that she might have actually kind of really held everyone at arm's length, and she was a very private person. So there's sometimes not a lot that we actually know about the inner workings and how she felt. I would say, though, in general, a historical artifact or record that reveals the true nature of a First Lady is often letters. Our senior curator, those are her favorite artifacts because sometimes they are just conversational with family. Sometimes they are about things happening politically. Sometimes it's about their health. And those are incredibly insightful. In general, we can learn a lot about the eras from which they come based on the accessories and dress that they wear. Especially in this era, a lot of them are coming from the Gilded Age and Progressive era, and that their fashion can really attest to that. There are other First Ladies we know very little about. Ellen Arthur never actually entered the White House herself. Martha Jefferson, we have no pictures or portraits of Martha Jefferson. It was actually their daughter, Martha Patsy Jefferson, who served as White House hostess. And even then, Dolly Madison served as the Jefferson White House hostess, too. So a lot of those early First Ladies, there's just stuff we don't know. And a lot of that comes from a lack of record. But when we're lucky, we get a letter or we get a postcard or we get a book where they've written something in it. And it's amazing how much insight that can actually provide. So that's a really great question. And I will say, as a soft brag, because we love our collection and it's priceless to us, we have over 5,000 objects in our collection and over 1,000 archives. So we're incredibly fortunate that we are considered the foremost repository of First Lady artifacts and research. Excellent question. Excellent. Well, I know that I talked a lot, and so you might not have questions right now, but I'd love to put my email in the chat. So that way, if you do think of something and you're like, I can't quite remember what you said, could you point me to some more resources? Please feel free to reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to help with your research or answer questions that you might have where you're sitting in bed later being like, okay, wait, what was that thing about Florence Harding? So please do feel free to reach out. Which first lady had the most lasting effect on the White House? Oh, Janice, that's a tough question. um, that is really tough because you could say just about any of them. We often say that it depends on the era because you have someone like Florence Harding who modernizes the role before Eleanor Roosevelt, but then you have someone like Jackie Kennedy who further takes it. Then you have someone like Nancy Reagan, who does like the first national fundraiser without congressional funds. So it depends on the era. Some people would say that it's Delhi Madison. Some would say Abigail Adams. Others would say that, of course, it's Jackie Kennedy. And others would say it's Pat Nixon. So I guess it just depends on exactly what you mean by the most lasting effect. I think they all do. So it's a good question and one that I think we talk about pretty much every day. So I'm sorry I don't have a very definite answer, but they are all unique, very much so, and leave lasting impacts. Janice, you're so welcome. You're so sweet. Well, so as I said, if you do have additional questions or something I can help clear up from my presentation, do feel free to reach out, come by and visit us. We'd love to have you.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much for the great program. I'm hesitant to hit the stop recording button because I'm afraid someone's furiously typing at their computer with their question, but I'll give it a few more seconds. But if not, again, yeah, thank you. And yeah, we have the contact information and well, yeah, hopefully this recording I won't accidentally delete it and it'll we'll be able to post it for anybody that wasn't able to see the whole thing. But again, yeah,
I
thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
thank you all. Thanks for sticking it out with me. Like I said, it's a long program, so I appreciate it. It's 7 women who live very full lives. So I appreciate you taking the time, especially in advance of Women's History Month. So let's all stay in touch. And if you need anything else, you guys know where to find me.
Okay, thanks.